Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and my channel is simply Discerning What is True. The date is the 29th day of January 2024. Going to be reading from Gerald Massey's work here called The Historical Jesus and the Mythical Christ. So I wanted to give you some background, that is, of Gerald Massey, or Massey, however you want to call it. Uh, this guy was a brilliant guy, tremendously brilliant guy. Um, so he was known as a poet. He was a Shakespearean scholar, a renowned Egyptologist. Is best remembered by his answering convictions. He pursued deeper things, and even though he came from a very poor family, so there were no excuses for him. You see, he just had a deep, deep desire for truth, and he pursued it all his life. And this is what we should be all doing. We should not make excuses for our lives and throw in the towel, so to speak. You see, his research led him to the conclusion that in Africa alone could be found the origins of myths, mysteries, symbols, languages, and religions. Egypt was the mouthpiece. He did not hesitate to undertake to prove that all Christendom were the dupes of delusion. That's right. Those of you who believe in Christianity and believing that there was a literal Jesus, you have been duped. You've been fooled by your religious people, those who actually lord over you, those who actually get paid to actually do this to you. The sad part simply is that they don't know what they're doing neither. They are just as lost as you are, you see. His zeal caused him to challenge the scientists, the theologians, the philologists, the anthropologists, and the sociologists. However, he did not rest his case there. He was too much the honest scholar for that. He didn't play games, folks. Therefore, he presented to his peers the abundant evidence resulting from his immense amount of research, which had been sifted through the most reliable authorities. In these present lectures, Gerald Massey renewed the contention that the gnosis of Christianity was primarily derived, gnosis meaning knowledge, primarily derived from Egypt on a various lines of descent, either through the Hebrews, the Persians, the Greeks, the Essenes, the Alexandrians, the Nazarenes. These converge in Rome, where the history was manufactured by identifiable matter recorded in the ancient book of wisdom. It was during this period that he delivered the lecture on Gnostic and historical Christianity. He clearly defeats the origins of Christianity and makes it unequivocally, or unequivocally, I should say, that it was not derived from Buddhism. Jesus spoke repeatedly about the Father. Massey said, the Buddha is the veiled God, unveiled it, the unmanifested made manifest, but not by not by the line of descent from father to son. Buddha was begotten by his own becoming before the time of the divine paternity. End quote. Long before man uttered a verbal prayer, he expressed himself by actions. He expressed himself by actions or gesture language. Massey discussed this at length in his book called "Man in Search of His Soul" during 50,000 years and how he found it. Present-day psychologists recognize gesture language as an indication of man's true unexpressed attitudes, or unconsciously, he assumes gestures revealing his thinking. The old cliche, actions speak louder than words. His own full circle and vindicated Massey. Massey had but one desire. He wanted to gain all the knowledge the past could afford him. He was just like a little child who was desiring to know the truth no matter what. He was going to try to uncover it and tend to supplement it with all that he known in the present. So he's going to use it to learn what he needed to learn. And all that is known in the present. He maintained it was impossible to understand the present without a profound knowledge of the past. Correct. Unless man comprehended the laws of evolution and past development and of present survival, it was impossible to form an opinion that would be of value to anyone, especially to himself. With patience and determination, he carried this out in all his writings. He had little patience with those who talked of the great occult secrets. He was convinced these so-called ancient mysteries were manufactured by pseudo-esoterics and occultists. The only interest Massey took in such matters was to determine how they had originated, to verify their supposed phenomenon, and to ferret out their meaning. He insisted the need for mystery vanished with the coming of the printing press and public experimental research. It became a passion with him to publish the facts as he saw them, and then to distribute the knowledge widely. In the seven souls of man, he said, the modern manufacture of ancient mysteries is a great imposition and sure to be found out. The mysteries called Christian, I look upon them as the greatest imposition of all, end quote. His own meditation on facts of both abnormal or extraordinary nature, which continued and were verified over the years, proved to him that mind existed and operated invisibly. He did not, so in other words, he's saying simply is that the deeper he was going into these things, there was someone outside of himself, that is the greater mind, was helping him to find this. He did not trouble about the other world at all, for it was in this world that people needed assistance. Correct. This is where people, many teachers out here are talking about all this stuff about some other world or some other planets, whatever. Folks, that doesn't concern us. It doesn't. You see, that's all gobbledygook, so to speak. It was in this world that people needed assistance, he said. Life to him was not worth living if something were not done to further its work. Quote, it is only in helping others that we can truly help ourselves, says Mr. Massey in the lecture, The Devil of Darkness in the Light of Evolution. To Gerald Massey, it was an unforgivable pretense for the clergy to continue to preach that man was a fallen creature. Yeah, man was a fallen creature. He's born in original sin. You see, that's baloney. And he continually pointed out that man could not be saved through prayerful intersection. Every advance made by science for humanity had been carried out through research and perseverance, not by praying to a jealous God. Massey proclaimed, quote, it is a sad farce for you to pray for God to work a miracle when you are doing all you can to prevent it, end quote. See, you are not doing anything. You're not researching things. You're not digging it. You're not digging deep, as I've said before. You're not pursuing it. You want it. You want it given to you. And it doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way, folks. God Himself sees your heart and sees your attitudes and sees your desires. And if you just want something to be put in your hand, expecting to work that way, it doesn't work that way. If you want to be a lawyer or a doctor or to run for office or whatever it is you're seeking in life, you just don't sit there, do you? You just sit there and wait for it and pray to God to that you'll be a lawyer. No, you have to do some schooling, you have to do some studying, you have to do some digging. It doesn't work any other way, folks. Speaking of creation, he saw it as a beginning with the first means of measuring and recording a cycle of time. In Genesis, the first day was measured by the morning and evening. To the present day, time continues to be measured by this identical method. Though years of observation, Massey recorded the outcome of such statements as, blessed, quote, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, end quote. He concluded that the meek did not inherit the earth and were not about to. Teachers had been woefully mistaken and unobserving. The death of Jesus could not save man from himself. Massey was adamant in pointing out that man was what he was as a result of what he had done. There was no dodging the law of cause and effect. One of Massey's greatest contributions in his lecture called The Coming Religion is pointedly with his sincerity. He put his all belief into every word. To him, every person must do his own thinking and have absolute freedom of expression. He stressed that the new religion must have sincerity of life, quote, in place of pretended belief, a religion of science in place of superstition, end quote. This religion will proclaim man's ascent rather than his fall. It will be a religion, in fact, a fact in the present, not a mere faith for the future. The temple will be what it is intended to be, the human form, rather than the edifice of brick and stone. And that was what Renee also spoke about in the works of Temple of Man. You are the temple. You have to realize that, you see. It will be a religion of accomplishment rather than of worship, and in place of the many creeds, it will be the religion of life. Above all, it will be a joyous religion. To realize such a religion, a man must be honest and courageous, as was Gerald Massey himself. His final plea in the book called Coming Religion was to urge man to hear in mind that the origins of evil in the moral dogma was derived from ignorance. It was Hermes who said, quote, the wickedness of a soul is its ignorance. To the Gerald Massey fittingly added that after gaining the consciousness to recognize the right, there is a man permissiveness that allows evil actions to take place. This was a quote thing from Sybil Ferguson as she shared this information. Anyway, let's get into the book here. The historical Jesus and the mythical Christ, all necessary references to the original authorities may be found in the author's, quote, natural genesis, end quote. In presenting my readers with some of the data which show that much of the Christian history was present as an Egyptian mythology, I have to ask you to bear in mind that the facts, like other foundations, has been buried out of sight for thousands of years in a hieroglyphic language that was never really read by Greek or Roman and could not be read until the last lost clue was discovered by Champolin, Chapollin, almost the other day. In this way, this was in the 1800s, is what he's talking about. In this way, the original sources of our mythology and Christology remain as hidden as those of the Nile until the century in which we live. The mystical matter enshrouded in the language was sacredly entrusted to the keeping of the very dead, who have faithfully preserved it as their book of life, which was placed beneath their pillows, or clasped into their bosoms, in their coffins and their tombs. Secondly, although I am able to read the hieroglyphics, nothing offered to you is based on my translation. I work too wary for that. The transcription and literal rendering of the hieroglyphic texts herein employed are by scholars of indisputed authority. There is no loophole of escape that way. I lectured upon the subject of Jesus many years ago. At that time, I did not know how we had been misled, or that the Christian, quote, Christian scheme, end quote, as it aptly is called in the New Testament, is a fraud, founded on a fable in the Old. I then accepted the canonic Gospels as containing a verifiable human history and assumed, as others do, that the history proved itself. Finding that Jesus, or Jehoshua ben Pandira, was a historical character known to the Talmud, I made the common mistake of supposing that this proved the personal existence of Jesus that is found portrayed in the canonic Gospels. But after you have heard my story and weighed the evidence now, for the first time collected and presented to the public, you will not wonder that I should have changed my views or that I should be impelled to tell the truth to others. So it now appears to myself, although I am only able to summarize here in the briefest manner possible a few of the facts that I have dealt with exhaustively elsewhere. The personal existence of Jesus as Jehoshaphat ben Pandira can be established beyond a doubt. One account affirms that according to a genuine Jewish tradition, that, quote, that man, who is not to be named, was a disciple of Jehoshaphat ben Panchira, end quote. It also says, quote, he was born in the 4th year of the reign of the Jewish king Alexander Janerius, notwithstanding the assertions of his fathers that he was born in the reign of Herod, end quote. That would be more than a century earlier than the date of birth assigned to the Jesus of the Gospels. But it can be further shown that Jehoshaphat ben Bandera may have been born consistently earlier even than of the year 102 BC, although the point is not of much consequences here. Jehoshaphat, son of Parachia, was a president of the Sanhedrin, the fifth, ranking from Ezra as the first one of those who is in the line of descent received and transmitted the oral law, as it was said, direct from Sinai. There could not be two of that name. This Ben Pachia has begun to teach as a rabbi in the year 154 BC. We may therefore reckon that he was not born later than 180 to 170 BC, and that it could hardly be later than 100 BC when he went down into Egypt with his pupil. For it is related that he fled there in consequences of a persecutions of the rabbis, feasibly conjectured to refer to the civil war in which the Pharisees revolted against King Alexander Janedius. And consequently, about 105 BC, if we put the age of his pupil, Jehoshaphat ben Pandera, at 15 years old, that will give a approximate date, extracting without pressure, which shows that Jehoshaphat ben Pandera may have been born about the year 120 BC. But 20 years are a matter of little amount here. Little moment here. According to Babylonian gematry, to the Mishah of Tract, Shaba, Shabbath, in quotes, this Jehusha, the son of Pandera, and Stada, Stada, was stoned to death as a wizard in the city of Lud, Lud, or Lydia, and afterwards crucified by being hanged on the tree on the eve of the Passover. This is a matter of death assigned to Jesus in the book of Acts. The Gemara says that these existed a transition that can only rest day before the Sabbath. They crucified Jehusha. On the rest day of the Passover, or Pascha, the day before the Passover, I should say. The year of his death, however, is not given in that account. But there are reasons for thinking it could not have been much earlier nor later than BC 70. Because the Jewish king Janedius reigned from the year 106 to 179 BC. He was succeeded in the government by his widow, Salome, Salome, whom the Greeks called Alexandria, and who reigned for some 9 years. Now the tradition, especially of the first, quote, Toldot Jehosha, end quote, relate that the queen of Janeris and the mother of Hyrcanus, who must therefore be Salome, in spite of her being called by another name, showed favor to Jehoshaphat and his teachings, and that she was a witness of his wonderful works, and power of healing, and tried to save him from the hands of the Salvadorian enemies, because he was related to her, but that during her reign, which ended in the year of 71 BC, he was put to death. The Jewish writers and rabbis with whom I have taught have always denied the identity of the Talmudic Jehoshaphat and the Jesus of the Gospels. Quote, this, observed Rabbi Chips, quote, which has been related to Jehoshaphat ben Parachia and his pupil, contains no reference whatsoever to him whom the Christians honor as God, end quote. Another rabbi, Saman Zevi, Zevi, produced 10 reasons for concluding that the Jehoshaphat of the Talmud was not he who was afterwards called Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth and of the canonic Gospels was unknown to Justus, to the Jew of Celtius, and of Josephus, the supposedly reference to him by the latter being an undoubted forgery. The blasphemy writings of the Jews about Jesus, end quote, as Justin Martyr calls them, always refers to Jehoshaphat ben Pandera and not to the Jesus of the Gospel. It is Ben Pandera they mean when they say they have another and a truer account of the birth and life, the wonder working and death of Jehoshaphat or Jesus. The reputation is perfectly honest and sounded base. The only Jesus known to the Jews was Jehoshaphat ben Pantera, who had learned the arts of magic in Egypt and who was put to death by them as a sorcerer. This was likewise the only Jesus known to Celsius, the writer of the true Logos, end quote. A work which the Christians managed to get rid of um, bodily with so many others of the anti-Christian evidences. Celsius observed that he was not a pure word, not a true logos, but a man who had learned the arts of sorcery in Egypt. So in the Clementines, it is the character of Ben Pandera that Jesus is said to rise again as the magician. But here is the conclusive fact. The Jews know nothing of Jesus, the Christ of the Gospels, as a historical character. And when the Christians of the 4th century trace his pedigree by the hand of Epiphanius, they are forced to derive that their Jesus from Pandera. Epiphanius gives the genealogy of the canonic Jesus in this way, or this wise. Japheth called Pandera, Mary equal Joseph equals Cleopas, and Jesus. This proves that in the 4th century the pedigree of Jesus was traced to Pandera, the father of that Jehoshaphat, who was the pupil of Ben Parachia, and who becomes one of the magicians in Egypt, and who was crucified as a magician at eve of the Passover by the Jews, in the time of Queen Alexandria, who has ceased to reign in the year 70 BC, the year therefore who lived and died more than a century too soon. Thus the Jews do not identify Jehoshaphat ben Pandera with the gospel of Jesus, or whom they, his supposedly contemporaries, know nothing, but protest against the assumption of as an impossibility, whereas the Christians do identify their Jesus as the descendant of Pandera. It was he or nobody, yet he was neither the son of Joseph nor the Virgin Mary, nor was he crucified at Jerusalem. It is not the Jews then, but the Christians who fuse two supposedly historical characters into one. There being but one history, a knowledge or known on either side, it follows that Jesus of the Gospels is the Jehusha of the Talmud, or is not at all as a person. This shifts the historical basis altogether. It antedates the human history by more than 100 years, and it at once destroys the hidden historical character of the Gospels, together with that of any other person of Jesus than Ben Pandera. In short, the Jewish history of the matter will be found to corroborate the mythical, as Epiphanius knew of no other historical Jesus than the descendant of Pandera. It is possible that this is the Jesus whose tradition is reported by Irenaeus. Irenaeus was born in the early part of the 2nd century, between 120 and 140 AD. He was Bishop of Lyons in France, and a personal acquaintance of Polycarp, and he repeats a tradition testified to by the elders, which he alleged was directly derived from John, that is, the, quote, disciple of the Lord, end quote, to the effect that Jesus was not crucified at 33 years old, but that he passed through every age and lived on to be a oldish man. Now, in a combination with the dates given, Jehoshaphat ben Pandera may have been between 50 and 60 years of age when put to death. And his tradition alone furnishes a clue to the nihilistic statement of Irenaeus. Irenaeus is one of the early church fathers. When the true tradition of Ben Pandera is recovered, it shows that he was the sole historical Jesus who was hung on a tree by the Jews, not crucified in the Roman fashion, and authenticates the claim now to be made on behalf of the astronomical allegory to the dispensational Jesus, the chronicle, the Kronian, Christ, the mythical Messiah, of the canonic Gospels, and the Jesus of Paul, who was not the carnalized Christ, for I hold that the Jesus of the other Gospel, end quote, according to the apostles Cephas and James, who was utterly repudiated by Paul, was none other than Ben Pandera, the Nazarene, or whom James was a follower, according to a comment on him found in the book of Abozazuma. Spell that for you. I may have pronounced it wrong. Abodazura. Abo Azura. Anyway, there are two Jesuses, or Jesus and the Christ, one of whom is repudiated by Paul. But Jehoshaphat, the son of Pandora, can never be converted into Jesus Christ, the son of a virgin mother, as a historical character. Not only do the dates given all ever be reconciled with contemporary history, the historical Herod who sought to slay the young child Jesus is known to have died 4 years before the date of the Christian era, a sign for the birth of Jesus. So much for the historical Jesus, and now for the mythical Christ. Here we can tread on firmer ground. The mythical Messiah was always born of the Virgin Mother, a factor unknown in natural phenomenon and one that cannot be historical, one that can only be explained by means of the mythos and those conditions of primitive sociology which are mirrored in mythology and preserved in theology. The Virgin Mother had been represented in Egypt by the maiden queen, Mut M. Yul, the future mother of Amenhotep III, some 16 centuries BC, who impersonated the eternal virgin, that produced the eternal child. 4 consecrated scenes reproduced in my book are found portrayed upon the innermost walls of the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Losar, which was built by Amenhotep III, a pharaoh of the 17th dynasty. The first scene on the left hand shows the god Taht, T-A-H-T, the lunar Mercury, the annunciator of the gods, in the act of hailing the Virgin Queen and announcing to her that she is to give birth to the coming son. In the next scene, the god Kneph, K-N-E-P-H, in brackets in conjunction with Hathor, in bracket, gives the new life. This is the Holy Ghost or Spirit that causes the Immaculate Conception. Yep, being the spirit by name is Egyptian. The natural effects are made apparent in the Virgin's swelling form. Next, the mother is seated on the midwife's stool, and the newborn child is supported in the hands of one of the nurses. The fourth scene is that of adoration. Here, the child is enthroned, receiving homage for the gods and gifts from men. Behind the deity of Kneph, on the right, 3 spirits, the 3 magi's, or kings of the legend, are kneeling and offering presents with their right hand and life with their left. The child thus announces incarnated, born, and worshiped, was the pharaonic representative of Atum Sun in Egypt, the god Adon of Syria, and Hebrew Adonah, the child, Adonaiah, the child Christ of the Atum, A-T-N, cult, the miraculous conception of the ever Virgin Mother, personated by Madame Yule, mother of the only child, and representative of the divine mother of the youthful sun god. That's S-U-N. These scenes, which were mythical in Egypt, have been copied or reproduced as historical in the canonic Gospels, which they stand like 4 cornerstones to the historical structure, and prove that the foundations are mythical. Jesus was not only born of the mythical motherhood, his descent on the maternal side is traced in accordance with this origin of the mythical Christ. The Virgin was also called the harlot because she represented the pre-monogamic stage of intercourse, and Jesus descended from 4 forms of the harlot, that is, Thamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, each of whom is a form of the quote, stranger in Israel, end quote. It is not a Hebrew woman. Such history, however, does not show that illicit intercourse was the natural mode of the divine descent, nor does it imply unparalleled human proficiency. It only proves the mythos. In human sociology, the son, that is S-O-N, of the mother, preceded the father as son of the woman who was a mother but not a wife. The characters likewise claim for Jesus, who is made to declare that he was earlier than Abraham, who was the typical great father of the Jews. Whether considered to be mythical or historical, Jesus states emphatically that he existed before Abraham was. This is only possible to the mythical Christ, who preceded the Father as Son of the Virgin Mother. And we shall find it so throughout. All that is non-natural and impossible as a human history is possible, natural, and capable, or is explicable, I should say, as mythos. It can be explained by mythos because it originates in that which alone accounts for it, or it comes to this at last. The more hidden the meaning in the gospel history, the more satisfactory it is explained by the mythos, and the more mystical the Christian doctrine, the more easily can it be proven to be mythical. The birth of Christ is astronomical. The birthday is determined by the full moon of Easter. This can only occur once every 19 years, as we have illustrated by the epoch of the golden number of the prayer book. Understand me, Jesus the Christ can only have a birthday or resurrection once in 19 years, in accordance with the melatonin cycle, because his parents are the sun, S-U-N-N, and moon, and those appear in the earliest representations of the man upon the cross. This proves the astronomical and non-human nature of the birth itself, which is identical with that of the full moon of Easter in Egypt. Cassini, the French astronomer, has demonstrated the fact that the date assigned for the birth of the Christ is astronomical epoch, in which the middle conjunction of the moon with the sun happened on the 24th day of March at 1:30 in the morning, as the meridian at the meridian of Jerusalem, the very day of the middle equinox. The following day, that is the 25th, was a day of incarnation, according to Augustine, but the date of the birth, according to Clement Alexander, that is. For two birthdays are assigned to Jesus by the Christian fathers, one at the winter solstice, the other at the vernal equinox. These, which cannot both be historical, are based on the two birthdays of the double Horus in Egypt. Plutarch tells us that Isis was delivered of Horus, the child, about the time of the winter solstice, and that the festival of the second or adult Horus followed the vernal equinox. The solar and spring equinox were both assigned to the one birth of Jesus by the Christologists, and again, that which is impossible as human history is, a natural fact in relation to the two Horuses, the dual form of the solar god in Egypt. And here in passing, we may point out the astronomical nature of the crucifixion. The gospel, according to John's brings on a tradition so different from that of the synopsis as to invalidate the human history of both. The synopses say that Jesus was crucified on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, N-I-S-A-N. John affirms that it was on the 14th of the month. The serious rift runs through the very foundation, as human history cannot be explained. But there is an explanation possible, which, if accepted, proves the mythos. The crucifixion, or crossing, was and still is. The word crucifixion is not crucifixion, folks. It's the crossing. Was and still is determined by the full moon of Easter. This is the lunar reckoning, would be on the 14th in the month of 28 days. Because at one time, all months were all 28 days because they were based upon a woman's cycle. In a solar month, it's 30 days. It was reckoned to occur on the 15th of the month. Both unite, and the rift closes in proving the crucifixion to have been astronomical, just as it was in Egypt, where the two dates can be identified. Plutarch also tells us how the Mithra cult had been particularly established in Rome about the year 70 BC, and Mithras was fabled as having been born in a cave. Wherever Mithras was worshipped, the cave was consecrated as his birthplace. The cave can be identified, and the birth of the Messiah in that cave, no matter under what name he was born, can be definitely dated. The cave of Mythos, quotes, was the birthplace of the sun, sun, in the winter solstice, when this occurred on the 25th day of December in the sign of the sea goat, with the Vedic equinox in the sign of the ram. Now the Akkadian name of the 10th month, that of the sea goat, which answers roughly to our December, the 10th by name is Abu Uda. That is the cave of light, quote, the cave of rebirth for the sun, sun, in the lowest depths at the solstice, figured at the, quote, cave of light. This cave was continued as the birthplace of the Christ. You will find it in all the Gospels of infancy. And Justin Martyr says, quote, Christ was born in the stable and afterwards took refuge in the cave, end quote. He likewise vouches for the fact that Christ was born on the same day that the Son was reborn in Stabulo, or in the statue of August, Augias. Now the cleansing of this stable was the sixth labor of Hercules, his first being in the sign of the lion, and Justin was right. The stable and the cave are both figured in the same celestial sign. But mark this. The cave was the birthplace of the solar Messiah from the year 2410 to the year 255 BC, at which later date the solstice passed out of the sea goat into the sign of the archer, and no Messiah, whether called Mithras, Anton, Tammuz, or Horus, or Christ, could have been born in the cave of Abba Uda, or the stable of the August, or the 25th of December after the year 255 BC. Therefore, Justin had nothing but the Mithras tradition of the bygone birthday to prove the birth of the historical cycle 255 years later. In their mysteries, like Saraceni celebrated the birth of the babe in the cave or subterranean sanctuary from which the priests issue and cried, quote, the virgin has brought forth, the light is about to begin to grow again, end quote. On the mother night of the year, and the Saraceni were not supporters of historical Christianity. The birthplace of the Egyptian Messiah at the American equinox was figured to be in April, in APT or APTA, the corner, but Apta is also the name of the crib and the manger. Hence, the child born in Apta was said to be born in a manger, and this Apta as crib or manger is the hieroglyphic sign of the solar birthplace. Hence, the Egyptian exhibited the babe in the crib or manger in the streets of Alexandria. The birthplace was indicated by the color of the equinox, and it passed from sign to sign. It also was pointed out by the star in the east, when the birthplace was in the sign of the bull. Orion was the star that rose in the east to tell where the young sun god was reborn. Hence, it's called the, quote, star of Horus, end quote. That was then the star of the, quote, three kings, who greeted the babe, for the three kings, quote, is still a name of the three stars in Orion's belt. Here we learn that the legend of the three kings is at least 6,000 years old. In the course of the procession, about 255 BC, the birthplace passed into the sign of the fishes, and the Messiah, who had been represented for 2,155 years by the ram or lamb, and previous for other 2,155 years by the Apis bull, was now imagined as the fish, or the fishman, called Ichthys, Ichthys, in Greek. The original fish man, the An of Egypt and the Oan of Chaldean, probably dates from the previous cycle precession or 26,000 years earlier. So what they're showing simply is how many years it takes the sun to the Earth go around, so to speak, in the process here, the sun. In about 255 BC, the Messiah, as the fish man, was to come up once more as the manifester from the celestial waters. The coming Messiah is called Dag, D-A-G, the fish in the Talmud, and the Jews at one time connected this coming with some conjunction or occurrence in the sign of the fishes. So it's talking about Pisces here. Um, this shows the Jews were not only in possession of the astronomical allegory, but also the tradition by which it could be interpreted. It was the mytholocal and Chronian Messiah alone who was or could be the subject of prophecy that might be fulfilled. Prophecy that was fulfilled as it is now, it is in the book of Revelation, when the equinox entered the cross, was re-erected, and the foundation of a new heaven were laid to the sign of the Ram, 2410 BC. And again, when the equinox entered the sign of the fishes in 255 BC. Prophecy that will be again fulfilled when the equinox enters the sign of the waterman about the end of the century, which the Sumerians are still looking forward for the coming of their Messiah, who has not yet arrived for them. The Christians alone ate the oyster. The Jews and Samaritans only got an equal share of the empty shells. The uninstructed Jews, the idiotic, at one time thought the prophecy, which was astronomical and solely related to the cycles of time, was to have its fulfillment in human history. But they found out their error and bequeathed it unexplained to the still more ignorant Christians. The same tradition of the coming one is extant among the millenarians and Adventists as among the Muslims. It is the tradition of El-Mahdi, the prophet who is to come in the last days of the world to conquer all the world, and who was later descending the Sudan with the old announcement, quote, the day of the Lord is at hand, end quote, which shows that the astronomical allegory has left some relics of the true tradition among the Arabs, who were at one time learned in astronomical lore. The Messiah as the fishman. So what's happening here, folks? People think, again, the day of the Lord, such and such. It's not, again, people are being programmed for fear in so many ways. And so when people think of the day of the Lord, they think this the day of the Lord is going to judge you, all of humanity here on this planet. And that's not so. It's just not. But this is always being talked about. It's always being programmed today. You hear it all over the place. Even secular people do this, you see. The Messiah as the fishman is foreseen by Esdras, E-S-D-R-A-S, ascending out of the sea at the, quote, same whom God the highest had kept a great season, which by his own self shall deliver the creature, end quote. The ancient fishman only came up out of the sea to converse with men and teach them in the daylight. When the sun set, end quote, says Berosus, B-E-R-O-S-U-S, he quotes, it was the custom of this being to plunge again into the sea and abide all night in the deep. So the man foreseen by Esdras is only visible by day. I just said, Eden, so can no man upon earth see my son, or there are those that he be with him, but in the daytime. This is parodic, or fulfilled in the, it's a this is a parable, so to speak, but it's a parodic or fulfilled in the account of Ithaca, the fish, the Christ who instructs men by day, but retires to the lake of Galilee, where he demonstrates his solar nature by walking the water at night or as the dawn of day. We're told that his disciples being on board a ship, quote, when even was come in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking upon the sea, end quote. Now the fourth watch began at 3 o'clock and ended at 6 o'clock. Therefore, this was about the proper time for a solar god to appear walking upon the water or coming up out of them as the Onus, O-A-N-N-E-S. Onus is said to have taken no food while he was with men. In the daytime, he used to converse with men, but took no food at that season, end quote. So Jesus, when his disciples prayed him, saying, quote, Master, eat, end quote, said unto them, quote, I have meat to eat that you know not of. My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, end quote. This is a perfect likeness of the character of Onnes, Oannes, who took no food, but whose time was wholly spent in teaching, whose time was wholly spent in teaching men. Moreover, the mythical fish man is made to identify himself. When the Pharisees sought a, quote, sign from heaven, end quote, Jesus said, another quote, there shall no sign be given but the sign of Jonas. Whereas Jonas became a sign unto the Ninevites, so shall also the Son of Man be to this generation. So they're talking about Jonah. He's talking about Jonas here, but it's Jonah, end quote. So, so this is what we would call three is a critical metaphysical number. Okay, uh, Phil Langdon's talked about that immensely. Um, Three is a critical number in metaphysics. The sign of Jonas is that of the On, O-A-N, or fishman of Nineveh, whether we take it directly from the monuments or from the Hebrew history of Jonah or from the zodiac. The voice of the secret wisdom here says truly that those who are looking for signs can have no other than that of the returning fishman, Ithacus, Onus, or Jonah. And assuredly there was no other sign to date other than those of Ithaca, the fish who was reborn of the fish goddess, Atergatis, Atergatis, in the sign of the fishes in 255 BC, after whom the primitive Christians were called little fishes or Pisidia. Pisidia. This date of 255 BC was the time date, or the true date of the birth, or rather, or rebirth of the celestial Christ. There was no valid reason for changing the time of the world. The gospel contained a confused and confusing record of early Christian beliefs. Things must truly believe, that is, parentheses here, in Luke, concerning certain mythical matters which were ignorantly mistaken for human and historical. The Jesus of our gospel is but little of a human reality, you see, in spite of all attempts to naturalize the mythical Christ and make the story look rational. The Christian religion was not founded on a man, but on a divinity that is a mythical character. So far from being derived from the model man, the typical Christ was made up from the features of various gods after a fashion somewhat like those, quote, pictorial averages, end quote, portrayed by Mr. Galton, Galton, in which the traits of several persons are photographed and fused is in a portrait of a dozen different persons merged into one that is not anybody. And as fast as the composited Christ falls into pieces, each feature is claimed, each character is gathered up by the original owner, as with the graphs of gravitation. It is not I that deny the divinity of Jesus the Christ. I assert it. He never was and never could be, and any other than a divinity. That is the character non-human and entirely mythical, who has been the pagan divinity of various pagan myths that have been pagan during thousands of years before our era. Correct. Completely correct. There was no human Jesus. Never was, folks. It was all used in what we call the astronomical signs also here. But someone seduced people long ago to believe there was a human Jesus, you see. Continue on. Nothing is more certain, according to honest evidence, than the Christian scheme of redemption is founded on a fable misinterpreted that the prophecy of fulfillment was solely astronomical, and the coming one as the Christ who came in the end of age or of the world. Just talking about end of age here. It's not the end of the world, folks, here. It's the end of the certain age here. End of the Aries age, and going into the age of Pisces, or of the world, was but a metaphorical figure, a type of time from the first, which never could take form in historical personality any more than time and person could come out of come out of a clock case when the hour strikes. That no Jesus could become a Nazarene by being born at or taken to Nazareth, and that the history in our Gospels is from the beginning to end the identifiable story of the Sun God, SUN-God, and the Gnostic Christ who never could be made flesh. When we did not know the one, it was possible to believe the other. But when once we truly know, then the false belief is no longer possible. The mythical Messiah was Horus in the Osirian mythos. Hara Kruti is the sun Typhon, and Klungsu is that of Amon Ra in the cult of Atum Ra. And the Christ of the Gospels is an amalgamate of all these characters. For example, the Christ is the Good Shepherd, so is Horus. Christ is the Lamb of God, so is Horus. Christ is the bread of life, so is Horus. Christ is the truth and life, so is Horus. Christ is the fan bearer, so is Horus. Christ is the Lord, so is Horus. Christ is the way and the door of life. Horus was the path for which they travel out of the sepulchre. He is the God whose name is written with the hieroglyphic sign of the road or way. Jesus is he that should come. And Iu, the root of the name is Egyptian, means to, quote, to come, end quote. Ium Kep as the suit, the son of Atum, Atum, or of Plot, Ptah, was the ever coming one, end quote, who is always portrayed as the marching youngster in the act and attitude of coming. Horus included both sexes. The child, or the soul, in brackets, is of either sex, and potentiality of both. Hence the hermaphroditia deity, and Jesus in Revelation is the young man who has the female paps, P-A-P-S. M-M-Pep signifies he who comes with peace. This is the character in which Jesus is announced by the angels, and when Jesus comes to his disciples after the resurrection, it is the bringer of peace. Quote, learn of me and you shall find rest, end quote, says the Christ. Chronosu Nefer Hep is the good rest, peace in person. The Egyptian Jesus, Ayum Hep, was the second Atum, A-T-U-M. Paul, Jesus, is the second Adam. In our rendition of John's Gospel, instead of the only, quote, the only begotten Son of God, end quote, a variant reading gives the, quote, only begotten God, which has been declared an impossible rendering. But the, quote, only begotten God, end quote, was a special type in Egyptian mythology. And the phrase re-identifies the divinity which Ambrose is the beetle, or Apollo says, to denote the only begotten or a father. The Egyptian delineated a scarlet beetle, or Scarabatus. By this, they symbolize an only begotten, because the creature is self-produced, being unconceived by a female, end quote. Now the youthful manifester of the beetle god was this Ayum-Hep, the Egyptian Jesus. The very phraseology of John is common to the inscriptions, which tell of him who was the beginner of the coming from the first, and who made all things, but who himself was not made. I quote verbatim, and not only was the beetle god continued in the, quote, only begotten Son, end quote, the beetle type was also brought on a symbol of the Christ. Ambrose and Augustine, among the church fathers or Christian fathers, identified Jesus with as the, quote, the good Scarabaeus, which means simply the beetle, which further identifies the Jesus of John's Gospel with the Jesus of Egypt, who was the ever-coming one and the bringer of peace, whom I have elsewhere shown to be the Jesus to whom the book of Ecclesiastes is inscribed in the Apocalypse. In accordance with the continuation of the Kamite symbols, it was also maintained by some sectarians that Jesus was a potter and not a carpenter. And the fact is that this only begotten beetle god, who is portrayed sitting at the potter's wheel, forming the egg or shaping the vase symbol of creation, was the potter personified, as well as the only begotten God in Egypt. The character and teachings of the canonic Christ are composed of contradictions which cannot be harmonized as those of a human being, whereas they are always true to the mythos. He is the Prince of Peace, and yet he asserts that he came not to bring peace. Quote, I came not to send peace, but a sword, end quote. And not only in Ayum Ephep, the bringer of peace by name in one character, he is the sword personified in the other. In this he says, quote, I am the living image of Atum, proceeding from him as a sword, end quote. Both characters belong to the mythical Messiah in the ritual, who also calls himself the, quote, great disturber, end quote, and the great tranquilizer, quote, the God contention, end quote, and the, quote, God peace. The Christ of the canonic Gospels has several prototypes, and sometimes the copy is derived or the trait is caught from one original and something from the other. The Christ of Luke's Gospel has a character entirely distinct from that of John's Gospel. Here he is the great exorciser, and that is the caster out of demons. John's Gospel contains no case of possessions or obsession. No certain man who, quote, had devils this long time, end quote. No child possessed with a devil. No blind or dumb man possessed with a devil. Other miracles are performed by the Christ of John, but not these, because John is a different type of the Christ. And the original of great healer in Luke's Gospel may be found in the God Khrusu, Khumsu, who was the divine healer, the supreme one among us all the other healers and saviors, especially the caster out of demons and the expeller of possessing spirits. He is called in the text the, quote, great God, the driver away of possession, end quote. In the stele, S-T-E-L-E, of the possessed princess, end quote, this God in its effigy is sent for by the chief Bahapton, that he may come and cast out a possessing spirit from the king's daughter, who has an evil movement in her limbs. The demon, recognizing the divinity just as the devil recognizes Jesus, the expeller of evil spirits. Also the god Khrusu is lord over the pig, a type of Sut, S-U-T. He is portrayed in the disc of the full moon of Easter in the act of offering the pig as a sacrifice. Moreover, in the judgment scene, when the wicked spirits are condemned and sent back into the abyss, their mode of return to the lake of primordial matter is by entering the bodies of swine. Says Horus to the gods, speaking of the condemned one, quote, when I send him to his place, he went, and he has been transformed into a black pig, end quote. So when the exorcist in Luke Gospel casts out Legion, the devils ask permission of the Lord of the pig to be allowed to enter the swine, and he gives them leave. This and much more that might be adduced tends to differentiate the Christ of Luke and identify him with Khunsu rather than with Ayum Kep, the Egyptian Jesus, who is reproduced in the Gospel according to John. This way, it can be proved that the history of the Christ in the Gospels is one long and complete catalog of likeness to the mythical Messiah, the solar or lunar solar God. The litany of Ra, for example, is addressed to the sun god in a variety of characters, many of which are assigned to the Christ of the Gospels. Ra is the supreme power, the beetle that rests in the Empyrean, who is born as his own son. This is already said in the God in John's Gospel, who says, quote, I and the Father are one. You see, end quote. Do you see what it's saying here? Who's born as his own son. So he, being God, is born as a son. And he doesn't need a mother, so to speak, here also. And who is the Father born as his own son? For he says, in knowing and seeing the Son, quote, From henceforth you know him and have seen him, i.e., the Father. Ra is designating the, quote, soul that speaks, end quote. Christ is the word. Ra is the destroyer of venom. Jesus says, quote, in my name they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them, end quote. And one character, Ra, is the outcast. So Jesus had not where to lay his head. Ra is the timid one who sheds tears in the form of an afflicted. He is called Remi, R-E-M-I, the weeper. The weeping god passes through Remrem, the place of weeping, and there conquers on behalf of his followers. In the ritual, the god says, quote, I have desolated the place of Remrem, end quote. This character is sustained by Jesus in the morning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, over Jerusalem that was to be desolated. The word of John, quote, Jesus wept, end quote, are like carven statue of the, quote, afflicted one as Remi the weeper. Ra is also the god who, quote, makes the mummy come forth. Jesus makes the mummy come forth in the shape of Lazarus. And in the Roman catacombs, the risen Lazarus is not only represented as a mummy, but is a Egyptian mummy, which has been eviscerated and swallowed for the eternal abode. Ra says to the mummy, quote, come forth, end quote. And Jesus cries, quote, Lazarus, come forth, end quote. Ra manifests as the burning one he who sends destruction, end quote. Or another quote here, sends his fire into the place of destruction, end quote. He also states here, he sends fire upon the rebels, end quote. His form is that of the, quote, God of the furnace, end quote. Christ also comes in the person of the, quote, burning one, end quote, the sender of destruction by fire. He is proclaimed by Matthew to be the baptizer with fire. He says, quote, I have come to send fire on the earth, end quote. So you see the representation here of Ra and Christ. He is portrayed as, quote, God of the furnace, which shall burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire, end quote. He is to cast the rebellious into the, quote, furnace of fire and send the condemned ones into everlasting fire. All this was natural would apply to the solar god and is supposed to become unnatural when misapplied to a supposed human being to whom it never could apply. The solar fire was the primary African fount of theological hellfire and hell. The litany, end quote, of Ra collects the manifold characters that make up the total God, quote, term, Tef-Nib, and the Gospels have gathered up the mythical remains. Thus, the result is each case identical or entirely similar. From beginning to end, the canonic Gospels contain the drama of the mysteries of the lunar solar god, narrated as a human history. The scene on the Mount of Transfiguration is obviously derived from the ascent of Osiris and the Mount of Transfiguration in the moon. The sixth day was celebrated as that of the change and transformation of the solar god in the lunar orb, which he re-entered on that day as a regenerator of his light. With this, we may compare the statement made by Matthew that, quote, after 6 days, Jesus went up into a high mountain apart, and he was transfigured, and his face did shine as the sun, of course, and his garments became white as the light, end quote. In Egypt, the year began soon after the summer solstice, when the sun descended from his midsummer height, lost his force, and lessened in its size. This represents Osiris, who was born of the Virgin Mother as the child Horus. The diminished infantile son, S-U-N, of autumn, the suffering, wounded, bleeding Messiah, as he was represented, he descended into hell, or Hades, where he was transformed into Virile, Horus, and rose again as the son, S-U-N, of the resurrection at Easter. In these two characters of Horus on the two horizons, Osiris furnishes the dual type for the canonic Christ, which shows very satisfactorily how the mythical prescribes the boundaries beyond which the historical dare not go. The first was the child Horus, who always remained a child. In Egypt, the boy or girl wore the Horus lock of childhood until 12 years of age. Thus, childhood ended about the 12th year, but although adulthood was then entered upon by the youth, and the transformation of the boy into manhood began, the full adulthood was not attained until he was 30 years of age. The man of 30 years was the typical adult. The age of adulthood was 30 years, as it was in Rome under Lex Papia. The Hamet fate is the man whose years are triad by tens and who is Khemt, Khemt. As with the man, so it is with the god and the second Horus. The same god and the second character is the Clem, or Clem Horus, the typical adult of 30 years. The god up to 12 years was Horus, the child of Isis, the mother child, the weakling. The viral Horus, that is the sun in his variant strength, quote, the adult of 30 years, was representative of the fatherhood, and this Horus is the anointed son of Osiris. These two characters of Horus, that is the child, and Horus the adult of 30 years, are reproduced in the only two phases of the life of Jesus in the gospel. John furnishes no historical data for the time when the Word was incarnated and became flesh, nor for the childhood of Jesus, nor for the transformation to the Messiah, but Luke tells us that the child of 12 years was the wonderful youth, and that he increased in wisdom and stature. This is the length of years assigned to Horus the child, and this phase of the child, quote, Christ's life, is followed by the baptism and anointing, the descent of the puberty spirit with the consecration of the Messiah in Jordan, when Jesus, quote, began to be about 30 years of age, end quote. The earliest anointing was the consecration of puberty, you see. And here at the full age of the typical adult, the Christ who was previously a child, the child of the Virgin Mother, is suddenly made into the Messiah as the Lord's anointed. And just as the second Horus was regenerated, and this time begotten to the Father, so in the transformation scene of the baptism in Jordan, the Father authenticates the change in full adulthood with a voice from heaven saying, quote, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased, end quote. The spirit of pubicine, or the Ruah, being represented by the descending dove called the Spirit of God. Thus, from the time when the child Christ was about 12 years of age until that of the typical Home Fe of Egypt, which was the age assigned to Horus when he became the adult god, there is no history. That's right, there is no history between 12 and 30. Someone asked that question last week with Phil, who answered that question. Let's see where we're at here. Okay, this is exact accordance with the Khamite allegory of the double Horus, and the mythos alone would account for the chasm, which is wide and deep enough to engulf a supposed history of 18 years. Childhood cannot be carried beyond the 12th year, and the child Horus always remained a child, just as the child Christ does in Italy and in German folk tales. The mythical record founded on nature went no further, and there the history consequently halts within the prescribed limits to begin with the anointed and regenerated Christ in the age of Khem, Khem Horus, the adult of 30 years. And these two characteristics of Horus necessitates a double form of the mother, who divides into the two divine sisters, Isis and Nephthys. Jesus also was bi matter, M-A-T-E-R, or dual mothered, and the two sisters reappear in the Gospels as the two Marys, both of whom are the mothers of Jesus. This again, which is impossible in human history, is perfect according to the mythos that explains it. You see, this is all being, you can see this, you can see the stories here, folks. You can see it if you can see the Egyptianology, being Egyptian, what was taught earlier teaching. And that's what Gerald Massey is trying to put together here for people to understand, because it doesn't make any sense literally, you see. So let's continue. As the child Horus, Osiris comes down to earth. He enters matter and becomes mortal. So he's, in a body deal. He's no longer in a spirit. He is born like the Logos, or as a word in quote, his father is Seth, S-E-B, the earth whose consort is Nude, the heaven, one of whom nature is Merit, M-E-R-I, the Lady of Heaven. And these two are the prototypes of Joseph and Mary. He is said to cross the earth as a substitute and to suffer precariously as the Savior, Redeemer, and Justifier of men. In these two characters, there was constant conflict between Osiris and Typhon. Typhon is the evil power, or Horus and Sut, the Egyptian Satan. At the autumn equinox, the devil of darkness began to dominate. This was the Egyptian Judas, who betrayed Osiris to his death at the Last Supper on the day of the great battle at the Vernal equinox. Osiris conquered as the ascending god, the Lord of the growing light. Both these struggles are portrayed in the Gospels. In the one, Jesus is betrayed to his death by Judas. In the other, he rises superior to Satan. The latter conflict follows immediately after the baptism. In this way, when the sun, S-U-N, was halfway around from the line sign, he crossed the river of the waterman, the Egyptian Larutana, Hebrew Jordan, Greek Eridanus. In this water, the baptism occurred and the transformation of the child Horus into the viral adult, the conqueror of the evil power, took place. Horus becomes hawk-headed, just where the dove ascends and abode on Jesus. Both birds represent the viral soul that constitutes the anointed one of puberty. By this added power, Horus vanishes Sut, S-U-T, and Jesus overcomes Satan. Both the baptism and the contest are referred to in the ritual. Quote, I am washed with the same water in which the good opener on Nefer, N-E-F-E-R, practice, washes when he disputes with Satan that justification should be made to on Nefer, the word made truth. End quote. Or the word that is law. The scene between the Christ and the woman at the well may likewise be found in the ritual here. Here, the woman is the lady with the long hair that is Nun, N-U. If you see that, you'll see that also in Egyptology. Their artwork is someone stretching over, and the woman's boobs are hanging out somewhat, and she stretches off here, such and such. And you see that in their artwork. You see, the consort of, and that's to do with the sky. You see, and the five husbands can be paralleled by her five star gods born of Seth. Osiris drinks out of the well, quote, to take away his thirst, end quote. He also says, I am creating the water. I make way in the valley, in the pool of the great one. Make road, or road maker, as he would say, expresses what I am, end quote. Another quote, I am the path by which they traverse out of the scepter of Osiris, end quote. So the Messiah reveals himself as the source of living water that springeth, quote, that springeth up into everlasting life, end quote. Later on he says, quote, I am the way, the truth, the life, end quote. Another quote, I am creating the water, discriminating the seat, S-E-A-T, end quote, says Horace. Jesus says, the hour cometh when you shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father, end quote. Jesus claims that this well of life was given to him by the Father. In the ritual, it says, quote, he is thine, O Osiris. A well or flow comes out of the mouth to him, end quote. Also, the paternic source is acknowledged in another text, quote, I am the Father, emanating when there is thirst, guarding the water. Behold me at it, end quote. Moreover, in another chapter, the well of living water becomes the pool of peace. The speaker says, quote, the well has come through me. I wash in the pool of peace, end quote. In Hebrew, the pool of peace is the pool of Salam or Salam. I'm sorry, I say pool of Salem or Salam. Sorry. And here, not only is the pool described as which the ossified are made pure and healed, and only does the angel or God descend to the waters. The quote certain times end quote are actually dated. The quote here again is, the gods of the pure waters are there on the fourth hour of the night and the eighth hour of the day, saying, quote, pass away hence to him who has been cured, end quote. An epitome of a considerable portion of John's gospel may be found in another chapter of the ritual, quote, ye gods, come to be my servants. I am the son of your Lord. Ye are mine through my Father who gave you to me. I have been among thy servants of Hathor or Merit, Meri. I have been washed by thee, O attendant. End quote. Compare the washing of Jesus' feet by Mary. The Osiris exclaims, quote, I have welcomed the chief spirits in the service of the Lord of things. I am the Lord of the fields when they are white, end quote, i.e., the reapers and the harvest. So the Christ now says to the disciples, quote, behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields that are white already unto the harvest, end quote. Then says he unto his disciples, quote, the harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest that he send forth laborers into his harvest. And he called unto him his 12 disciples, end quote. Now, if we turn to the Egyptians' book called Book of Hades, end quote, the harvest, the Lord of the harvest, and the reapers of the harvest are portrayed. The 12 are also there in one scene that are preceded by a god leaning on a staff, who is designated the Master of Joy, a surname of the Messiah Horus, when assimilated to the Soli lunar Krosun. The 12 are, quote, they who labor at the harvest in the plains of Netar Kar, end quote. A bearer of a sickle shows the inscription, quote, these are the reapers, end quote. The 12 are divided into two groups of 5 and 7. The original 7 of Anhinura, that's Ahenru. These 7 are the reapers. The other 5 are bending towards an enormous ear of corn, the image of the harvest, ripe and ready for the sickles of the 7. The total 12 are called the, quote, happy ones, end quote, the bearers of food. Another title of the 12 is that is called the, quote, just ones, end quote. The God says to the reapers, quote, take your sickles, reap your grain, honor to you reapers, end quote. Offerings are made to them on earth as bearers of sickles in the fields of Hades. On the other hand, the tares or the wicked are to be cast out and destroyed forever. These 12 are the apostles in their Egyptian phase. In the chapter on celestial diet, quote, in the ritual, Osiris eats under the sycamore tree at Hathor. He says, quote, let him come from the earth. Thou hast brought these 7 loaves for me to live by, bringing the bread that Horus, quote, the Christ makes. Thou hast eaten rations. Let him call to the gods for them, or the gods come with them to him, end quote. Again, 7 is another key word here. What I call somewhat metaphysics too. This is reduced. This is there. 3 and 7 are always spoken of in the Bible. Those are critical numbers, and so is 12. You see, 12 disciples. Whether that's not they're representing the 12 aspects of the astrology itself. Anyway, let me get back to this thing here as time is going by. This is reproduced as miracles in the gospel performed when the multitude were fed upon 7 loaves. You remember that? The 7 loaves are found here, all together with the calling upon the gods or working the miracle of multiplying the bread. In the next chapter, there is a scene of eating and drinking. The speaker who impersonates the Lord says, quote, I am the Lord of bread and Anu. My bread is the heaven was that of Ra. My bread on earth was that of Seth. The 7 loaves represents the bread of Ra. Elsewhere, the number prescribed to be set on one table as an offering is 5 loaves. These are also carried on the heads of 5 different persons in the scene of the underworld. 5 loaves are the bread of Seth, S-E-H. Thus, 5 loaves represents the bread of earth, and 7 the bread of heaven. Both 5 and 7 are sacred regulation numbers in the Egyptian ritual. And in the Gospel of Matthew, the miracles are wrought with 5 loaves in one case and 7 in the other, when the multitudes are fed on celestial diet. This will explain the 2 different numbers in one and the same gospel miracle. In the canonic narrative, there is a lad with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. In the next chapter of the ritual, we'll possibly meet with the lad himself, as the miracle worker says, quote, I have given breath to the said youth, end quote. The Gnostic asserted truly that celestial persons and celestial scenes had been transferred to earth in our Gospels. It is only within the Pleronium, that is the heaven, or in the zodiac that we can at times identify the originals of both. And it is there we must look for the 2 fishes, end quote. As the latest form of the manifestor was in the heaven of the 12 signs, that probably determined the number of 12 basketfuls of food remaining when the multitude had all been fed. Quote, they that ate the loaves were 5,000 men, end quote. And 5,000 was the exact number of the celestial or gods in the Assyrian paradise before the revolt. Let's see, where was I at here? Before the revolt and fall from heaven. The scene of the miracle of the loaves and fishes is followed by an attempt to take Jesus by force, but he withdraws himself, and this is succeeded by the miracle of his walking on the waters and conquering the wind and waves. So it is in the ritual, chapter 57, is that of the brief breath prevailing over the water in Hades. The speaker having to cross over says, O Hapi, Hapi, let the Osiris prevail over the waters like as the Osiris prevailed against us, taking my stealth the night of the great struggle, end quote. The solar god was betrayed to his death by the Egyptian Judas, quote, on the night of the taking by stealth, end quote, which was the night of the Last Supper. The god is, quote, waylaid by the conspirators who have watched very much, end quote. They are said to smell him out. That is by, quote, by the eating of his bread, end quote. So the Christ is waylaid by Judas, who, quote, knew the place, for Jesus often resorted thither, end quote, and by the Jews who had long watched to take him. The smelling, I should say, of Osiris by the eating of his bread is remarkably rendered by John at the eating of the Last Supper. The ritual has it, quote, they smell Osiris by the eating of his bread, transporting the evil of Osiris, end quote. Now another quote. And when he had dipped the sap, or sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, and after the sop, Satan entered into him. Then said Jesus to him, whom the evil or devil has been transported, quote, that thou doest, do it quickly, end quote. Osiris was the same, beseeching burial. Here he is demonstrable that the non-historical Herod is a form of Apophis serpent, called the enemy of the sun, S-U-N, in Syriac. Herod is a red dragon. Herod in Hebrew signifies a terror. Henru, H-E-R-U, Heru, English is to terrify, and Herod, H-E-R-R-U-T, is the snake, the typical reptile. The blood of the divine victim that is poured forth by the Apophis serpent at the 6th hour on the night of smiting the profane, end quote, is literally shed by Herod as the Herod or typhonic serpent. The speaker in the ritual asks, quote, who art thou, then, Lord of the silent body? I have come to see him who is in the serpent, that is eye to eye and face to face, end quote. Next quote, Lord of the silent body, end quote, is a title of the Osiris. End quote here, who art thou then, Lord of the silent body, end quote, is asked and left unanswered. This character is also assigned to the Christ. the high priest said unto him, quote, answerest thou nothing? End quote. But Jesus held his peace. Quote, Herod questioned him in many words, but he answered him nothing. He acts the prescribed character of, quote, Lord of the silent body, end quote. The transaction in the 6th hour of the night of the crucifixion is expressed inexpressibly to the gospel we read. Now, the 6th hour, quote, now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour, end quote. The 6th hour being midnight, you see, that shows the solar nature of the mystery, which has been transferred to the 6th hour of the day in the gospel. It is the 7th hour, the mortal struggle takes place between Osiris and the deadly Apophis, or the great serpent, Haber, Haber, 450 cubits long, that fills the whole heavens with his vast enveloping folds. The name of this 7th hour is, quote, that which wounds the serpent, Haber, Haber, end quote. In this conflict with the evil power, thus portrays the sun god is designated the, quote, the conqueror of the grave, end quote, and is said to make his advance through the influence of Isis, who aids him in repelling the serpent or devil of darkness. In the gospel, Christ is likewise set forth in the supreme struggle as, quote, conqueror of the grave, end quote. For, next quote, the graves were open and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, end quote. And Mary represents Isis, you see, the mother at the cross. It is said of the great serpent, that is, quote, there are those on earth who do not drink of the waters of this serpent, Haber, Haber, end quote, which may be parallel with the refusal of Christ to drink the vinegar mingled with gall. When the God had overcome the Apophis serpent, his old nightly, annual, and eternal enemy, he exclaims, quote, I come, I have made my way. I have come like the sun through the gate of the one who likes to deceive and destroy, otherwise called the viper. I have made my way. I have bruised the serpent. I have passed, end quote. But the more expressed represented in the mysteries was that of the annual sun, S-U-N, as the elder Horus or Atum, A-T-U-M, as Julius Firmius, F-I-R-M-I-C-U-S, says, quote, in the solemn celebration of the mysteries, all things in order had to be done, which the youth either did or suffered in his death, end quote. Diodorus Siculus rightly identified the, quote, whole fable of the underworld, end quote. That was dramatized in Greece as having been copied from, quote, from the ceremonies of the Egyptian funerals. End quote, and so brought on from Egypt into Greece and Rome. One part of this mystery was the portrait of the suffering sun god in a feminine phase. When the suffering sun was ailing and ill, he became female, such being a primitive mode of expression. Luke describes the Lord in the Garden of Gethsemane as being in great agony, and his sweat was, as it were, great drops of blood falling to the ground. End quote. This expression, this experience, the Gnostics identify with the suffering of their own Himmersring, Sophia, whose passion is the original of that which is celebrated during Passion Week, the, quote, week of weeping, and Abtu, A-B-T-U, end quote, and which constitutes the fundamental mystery of the Rosy Cross and the roses, or the rose of silence. So you can see how this all is just tying in here. This is all, it's just being a production that was done, long ago in Egypt. Now it's being redone into the Middle Eastern part of the world, especially Israel, and then it's passed on eventually to even to Greece and to Rome. And it's sharing all this information through stories, you see. In this agony and bloody sweat, the Christ simply fulfills the character of Osiris Tesh, the red sun, the sun god that suffers his agony and bloody sweat, and Simon, whose Gesman, or Gethsemane. Tesh means the bleeding, red, gory, separate, cut, and wounded. Tesh is the inert form of the god who's suffering, like that of Ananias, Ananias, was represented as the feminine, which alone reaches a natural origin for this type. He was also called Anas, A-N-S, Ra, or the sun bound up in linen. So natural were the primitive mysteries. My attention has just been called to a passage in Lycothoron, who lived under Ptolemy, Ptolemy, in Philadelphia between 310 and 246 BC, and Aridius is referred to as, quote, that three-nighted line, whom of old Triton, fierce dog, with furious jaw devour, within whose in bowels, tearing up his liver, he rolled, burning with heat, through without fire, his head with drops of sweat bedew all over, end quote. This describes the god suffering his agony and sweat, which is called the bloody flux, end quote, of Osiris. Here, the nights are 3 in number, so the Son of Man was to be 3 nights as well as 3 days in the heart of the earth, end quote. In the Gospels, this prophecy is not fulfilled, but if we include the night of the bloody sweat, we have the necessity of 3 nights, and the mythos become perfect. In this phrase, the suffering son was the red sun, whence the typical red line. As Atom, that is the red sun, is described as setting from the land of light in all of the colors and crimson, or Pan, P-A-N-T, the red pool. This clothing of colors is represented as a, quote, gorgeous robe by Luke, a purple robe by Mark, and a robe of scarlet by Matthew. As he goes down at the autumn equinox, he is the crucified. His mother, Noon, or Mary, the heaven, seeing her son, the Lord of terror, greatest of the terrible, setting from the land of life with his hands drooping, she becomes obscure, and there is great darkness over all the land, as at the crucifixion described by Matthew, in which the passing of the Lord of terror is rendered by the terrible, or, quote, loud cry, end quote, or Semnotic version, the sun god, S-U-N, causes the dead or those in the earth to live as he passes down into the underworld, because as he entered the earth, the tombs were open. Underworld, tombs are open, i.e. figuratively. But it is reproduced here literally by Matthew. So the death of Osiris is the ritual. It's followed by the, quote, night of the mystery of the great shapes, end quote. And it is explained that the night of the great shapes is when there has been made the embalming of the body of Osiris, quote, the good being, justified forever, end quote. In the chapter on, quote, the night of the laying out, end quote, of the dead body of Osiris, is said that, quote, Isis rises on the night of the laying out of the dead body to lament over her brother Osiris, end quote. And again, quote, the night of the laying out, end quote, of the dead, Osiris is mentioned, and again it is described as that of which Isis has risen, quote, to make a wail for her brother, end quote. But this is also the night on which he conquers his enemies and receives the birthplace of the gods, end quote. Another quote, he tramples on the bandages that make for their burial. He raises his soul and conceals his body, end quote. So the Christ is found to have unwound the linen the bandage of burial, and they saw the linen in one place and the napkin in another. He too conceals his body. This is closely reproduced or parallel in John's Gospel, where it is Mary Magdalene who rises in the night and comes to the sepulchre, quote, while it was yet dark, end quote, to find the Christ arisen as the conqueror of death and the grave. In John's version, after the body is embalmed in 100 pounds weight of spice consisting of myrrh And alloys, we have the, quote, night of the mystery of the shapes, end quote. For while it was yet dark, quote, Mary Magdalene coming to the sepulchre and peering in sees the two angels in white sitting, the one at the head, the other at the feet, where the body had lately lain, end quote. And in a chapter of, quote, how a living being is not destroyed in hell, or the hour of life ends not in Hades, end quote. There are two youthful gods, quote, two youths of life, light, L-I-G-H-T, who prevail as those who see the light. And the vignette shows the deceased walking off. He has risen. Matthew has only one angel or splendid presence whose appearance was as lighting, which agrees with Shepi, S-H-E-P-I, the splendid one, who, quote, lights the sarcophagus, end quote, as a representation of the divinity. Ra, the risen Christ, who is first seen and recognized by Mary, says to her, touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father, end quote. The same scene is described by the Gnostics when Sophia rushes forward to embrace the Christ, who restrains her by exclaiming that he must not be touched. In the last chapter of the, quote, preservation of the body in Hades, end quote, there's much mystical matter that looks plainer than when written out in John's Gospel. It is said of the regimented or risen God, quote, may the Osirian speak to thee, end quote. The Osirian does not know. He, that is Osiris, knows him. Quote, let him not grasp him, end quote. The Osirified, quote, comes out sound, immortal in his name, end quote. Another quote, he has passed along the upper roads, end quote. That is, as a risen spirit. Quote, he is who grasps with his hand, quote, and gives the palpable proof of continual personality, as does the Christ, who says, quote, see my hands and my feet, that it is I, myself, end quote. So the sun god re-arises on the horizon, I should say, where he issues forth, quote, saying to those who belong to his race, give me your arm, end quote, says Orphied deceased. Quote, I am made as ye are, end quote. Next quote, let him explain it, end quote. As he reappears, the Christ demonstrates that he is made as they are. Quote, see my hands and feet, that it is I, myself, handle me and see. And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. Then he said to Thomas, reach hither thy finger and see my hands, and reach hither thy hands and put it into my side, end quote. These descriptions correspond to that of the cut, wounded, and bleeding, quote, sun god, who says to his companions, quote, give me your arm, I am made as ye are, end quote. In the Gospels of Hebrew is made to exclaim, quote, for I am not a bodiless ghost, but in the original, when the risen one says to his companions, quote, give me your arm, I am made as ye are, end quote. He speaks as a spirit to spirit, whereas in the Gospels, the Christ has to demonstrate that he is not a spirit because the scene has been transferred into an earth life. The Gnostics truly declare that all supernatural transactions asserted in the Christian gospel were, quote, counterparts or representation of what took place above, end quote. That is, they affirm the history to be mythical, the celestial allegory made mundane, and they were in the right, as the Egyptian gospel proves. There are healers, and just Hushua ben Pandera may have been one. But because that is possible, we must not allow it to vouch for the impossible. Thus, in the Gospels, the mythical is and has been continually reproduced as miracle. That which naturally pertains to the character of the sun god becomes supernatural in appearance when brought down to earth. The solar god descended into the water, descended into the nether world as the restorer of the bound to liberty, the dead to life. In this region, the miracles were wrought and the transformation took place. The evil spirits and destroying powers were exorcised from the mummies. The halt and the maimed were enabled to get up and go, the dead were raised, a mouth was given to the dumb, and the blind were made to see. Quote, this reconstitution of the deceased, end quote, is transferred to the earth life, whereupon the, quote, blind receive their sight and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, end quote, at the coming of the Christ, who performed the miracles. The drama which the Iate mistook for human history, it should be idiots, for human history were performed by the sun god in another world. Misprint there. I could keep on all day and night or give a dozen lectures without exhausting my evidence that the canonic Gospels are only a later literalized reshuffle of the Egyptian writings, the representations and the mysteries, and the oral teachings of the Gnostics, which passed out of Egypt to Greece and Rome. But there is plenty more proof where this comes from. I can but offer a specimen that is brick of that which is elsewhere a building set four square and sound against every blast that blows. The Christian dispensation is believed to have been ushered into the birth of a child and the portray of the child in the Roman catacombs as the child of Mary and the youthful sun god in the mummy image of the child king. The Egyptian Charis or Christ, the alleged facts of our Lord's life as Jesus the Christ, were equally the alleged facts of our Lord's life as the Horus of Egypt, whose very name signifies the Lord. The Christian legends were first related to Horus the Messiah, the solar hero, the greatest hero that ever lived in the mind of man, not in the flesh, the only hero to whom the miracles were natural because he was not human. From beginning to end, the history is not human, but divine, and divine is the mythical. From the descent of the Holy Ghost to overshadow Mary to the ascension of the risen Christ as the end of 40 days, according to the drama of the pre-Christian mysteries. The subject matter, the characters, occurrence, events, acts, and sayings bear the impress of the mythical mold instead of the stamp of human history. Right through the idea which shaped the history were pre-extant and identifiable pre-Christian, and so we see this strange sight today in Europe of over 100 million pagans masquerading as Christians. Whether you believe it is not does not matter. The fatal fact remains that every trait and feature which go to make up the Christ as divinity and every event or circumstance taken to establish the human personality were pre-extant and pre-applied to the Egyptian and Gnostic Christ, who never could become flesh. Jesus Christ with female paps, who is the Alpha and Omega of Revelations, was the IU of Egypt and the IO of the Chaldeans. Jesus is the Lamb of God, and Antipas the fish was Egyptian. Jesus is the coming one. Jesus born the Virgin Mother, who was overshadowed by the Holy Ghost. Jesus born of two mothers, both of whose names are Mary. Jesus born in the manger at Christmas and again at Easter. Jesus saluted by the three kings or magi. Jesus of the transfiguration on the mount. Jesus whose symbol is in the catacombs in the eight-ray star, the star of the east. Jesus as the eternal eternal child. Jesus is God the Father, reborn as his own son. Jesus is a child of 12 years. Jesus is an anointed one of 30 years. Jesus in his baptism. Jesus walking the water or working his miracle. Jesus as a caster out of demons. Jesus as a substitute who suffered as a vicarious atonement for sinful men. Jesus whose followers are two brethren, the four fishers, the seven fishers, the 12 apostles, the 70 or 72 in some texts, whose names were written in heaven. Jesus who was administered to by 7 women. Jesus Jesus in his bloody sweat. Jesus betrayed by Judas. Jesus as conqueror of the grave. Jesus the resurrection and the life. Jesus before Herod, in the Hades, and in the reappearance to the women, and to the 7 fishes. Jesus was crucified, both on the 14th and 15th of the month Nisan, which is, I think, is the month of April as well as I recollect. Jesus who was also crucified in, maybe I'm March, take that back. Jesus who was also crucified in Egypt as it is written in Revelations. Jesus as judge of the dead with the sheep on the right hand and the goats on the left. is Egyptian from first to last in every phase, from the beginning to the end. Make whatever you can of Jehoshua ben Pandera. In some of the ancient Egyptian temples, the Christian anakas, when tired of hacking and hooing of the symbolic figures incised in the chambers of imagery and defacing the most prominent figures of the monuments, found they could not dig out the hieroglyphics and took to covering them over with plaster or temper. And this plaster, intended to hide the meaning and stop the mouth of the stone word, had served to preserve the ancient writings as fresh in hue and sharp in outline as when they were first cut and colored. In a similar matter, the temple of the ancient religion was invaded and possession gradually gained by connivance of the Roman power, and that enduring fortress not built but quarried out of the solid rock was stucco all over the front and made white a while with its look of brand newness, and reopened under the sign of another name, that of the carnalized Christ. And all the time, every nook and corner were darkly alive with the presence and proofs of the earlier gods and pre-Christian originates, even though the hieroglyphics remained unread until the time of Campollion. But stucco is not for lasting wear. It cracks and crumbles, slops off, and slings away into the native insignificance. The rock is the sole true foundation. The rock is the only record in which we can reach reality at last. Wilkinson, the Egyptologist, has actually said of Osiris on earth, quote, some may be disposed to think that the Egyptians, being aware of the promises of the real Savior, had anticipated that event, regarding it as though it had already happened, and introduced that mystery into their religious system, end quote. This is what obstetrics termed a, quote, false presentation, a birth feet foremost. We are also told by writers of the catacombs and the Christian iconographs that the figure is Osiris as a type of Christ. This is Pan, Apollo, Aristus as a type of Christ. This is Harpocrates as a type of Christ. This is Mercury, but as a type of Christ. This is the devil, or Seth Mercury was the devil as the type of Christ, until long hearing of the facts reversed, perverted, and falsified makes one feel as if under a nightmare which has lasted for 18 centuries, knowing the truth to have been buried alive and made dumb all that time, and believing that it has only to get voice and make itself heard to end the lying once for all, and bring down the curtain of oblivion of last upon the most pitiful drama of delusion ever witnessed on the human stage. And here the worst foes of the truth have ever been and still are the rationalizers of the mythos, as such as the Unitarians. They have assumed the human history as the starting point and accepted the existence of a personal founder of Christianity as the one initial and fundamental fact. They have done their best to humanize the divinity of the mythos by discharging the supernatural and miraculous element in order that the narrative might be accepted as history. Thus, they have lost the battle from the beginning by fighting it on the wrong ground. The Christ is a popular lay figure that never lived, and a lay figure of pagan origins, a lay figure that was once the ram and afterwards the fish, a lay figure that is human form was to portray an image of a dozen different gods. The imagery of the catacombs shows that the types there represented are not the ideal figures of the human reality. They are the sole reality for 6 or 7 centuries after AD, because they have been so in the centuries long before. There is no man upon the cross in the catacombs of Rome for 700 years. The symbolism, the allegories, the figures and types brought on by the Gnostics remain there just what they had been to the Romans, Greeks, Persians, and Egyptians. Yet the dummy idea of paganism is supposed to have become dutable, real as the God who was made flesh to save mankind from the impossible, quote, fall. Remember that the primary foundation stone for history in the New Testament is dependent upon the fall of man being a fact in the Old, whereas it was only a fable which had its own mythical and unhistorical meaning. When we try over again that the first step, once taken in the dark, we find no foothold for us because there was no star. The fall is absolutely non-historical and consequently the first bit of standing ground for actual Christ. The Redeemer is missing in the very beginning. Anyone who set up or was set up for a historical savior from the non-historical fall could only be a historical impostor. But the Christ of the gospel is not even that. He is no sense a historical personage. It is impossible to establish the existence of a historical character, even as an impostor, for such a one or two witnesses. Astronomically, mythology and Gnosticism completely prove an alibi forever. From the first supposed catastrophe to the final one, the figures of the celestial allegory were ignorantly mistaken for matters of fact, and thus the Orthodox Christolater is left as last to climb to heaven with one foot resting on the ground of a redemption that must be false if his fraud frown on a fable. And I'm going to probably end here. My voice is getting a little tired, so been about almost 2 hours reading. I might try to see how far is left here. Actually, it's almost finished, so let's just finish this. Got 2 more pages here. How about that? Let's see where I was at. Yeah, I've done that part there. Okay, I think this is where I ended. I see. Every time the Christian turns to the east about his obedience to the Christ, it is a confession that the cult, C-U-L-T, is solar, the omission being all the more fatal because it is unconscious. Every picture of the Christ with the halo of glory and the accompanying cross of the equinox prophets prove. The Christian doctrine of resurrection furnishes evidence absolutely conclusive of the astronomical and chronicle nature of the origins. This is to occur. It always did at the end of a cycle or at the end of the world. Again, the end of the world is basically the end of the cycle. Please do not think of the end of the world that way, please. Because that's what everybody's talking about and keeps people in fear. And it's not true. It's just the end of the cycle. We go around the whole thing here, approximately 26,000 years, okay? Christian revelation knows nothing of immortality except in the form of periodical renewal dependent on the, quote, coming one, end quote. And the resurrection of the dead still depends on the day of judgment and the last day and the end of the world. They have no other world, you see. Their only other world is as the end of this. Now there are no fools living who would be fools big enough to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a bark or rotten, unseaworthy as this, in which they hope to cross the dark river of death, and on a pier of cloud he landed safe in heaven. The Christian theology was responsible for substituting faith instead of knowledge. And the European mind is only just beginning to recover from the mental paralysis induced by that doctrine which came to its natural culmination in the Dark Ages. The Christian religion is responsible for enthroning the cross of death in heaven with a deity on it, doing public penance for a private failure in the commencement of creation. It has taught men to believe that the vilest spirit may be washed white, and the atoning blood of the purest offered up a bribe in the avenging God. It has divinized a figure of helpless human suffering and a face of pitiful pain as if there were not but a great heartache at the core of all things, or the vast infinite were but a veiled and sad-eyed sorrow that brings visible to birth in the miseries of human life. But in the old pagan world, quote, in the old pagan world, man deified the beautiful, the glad, end quote, as they will again upon a loftier pedestal, when the fable of the fictitious fall of man and false redemption by the cloud begotten God has passed away like a phantasm of the night, and men awake to learn that they are here to wage ceaseless war upon sordid suffering, remedied wrong, and preventable pain, here to put an end to them, not to hypothesize an efficiency of sorrow to be adorned as a type of eternity. For the most beneficial is the most beautiful. The happiest are the healthiest. The most godlike is the most glad. The Christian cult has fanatically fought for its false theory and waged incessant warfare against nature and evolution. Nature intention made somewhat visible and against some of the noblest instincts during the 18th centuries. Seas, S-E-A-S, of human blood have been spilled to keep the bark of Peter afloat. Earth has been honeycombed with the graves of the martyrs of free thought. Heavens has been filled with a horror of great darkness in the name of God. 18 centuries are a long while in the lifetime of a lie, folks, but a brief span in the eternity of truth. The fiction is sure to be found out, and the lie will fall at last. At last, at last. So here's his poem, I think. No matter through its towers to the sky and darkens earth, you cannot make the lie. Immortal through suspendious enshrine by art in every perfect mold of mind. Angelo, Raphael, Milton, and Handel, all its pillars cannot stay it from the fall. The pyramids of imposture reared by Rome, all of cement for an eternal home, must crumble back to earth, and every gust shall revel in the desert of its dust. And when the prison of the immortal, that is mine, had fallen to set free the bound and blind, no more shall life be one long dread of death. Humanity shall breathe with ample breath, expand in spirit and in stature rise, to match its birthplace of the earth and skies. So that's the conclusion of this particular chapter from Gerald Massey today. So thank you for being here. I appreciate you being here, and I hope that this kind of clears some things up. Again, Gerald Massey is a brilliant writer in the past, and if you can get any of his books, is well worth it. And so, anyway, my voice is just about gone. So, but anyway, it's 2 hours, well worth it. A lot of good information there, and you can see where a lot of this has been taken from. And so, thank you for being here again today, and I wish you well. And you take care. Have a good night. Take care.